Today, we are honored to host Mr. Sebastian Junger on the 77th anniversary of the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944. Sebastian is the author of many best-selling books, including The Perfect Storm, War, and Tribe. He's also a filmmaker, and if you haven't seen his documentaries, Restrepo or Korengal, you absolutely must. For many veterans, and especially me personally, telling stories of war and trying to make people feel and understand and empathize with what it was like on the ground in Afghanistan or Kandahar is a difficult task. I was not trained in the art of metaphor, but Sebastian's work is the artistic expression that, in my opinion, most vividly paints the picture of what life was like on the ground in the global war on terror. He holds a special place in my library. And today we are discussing his newest book and, in my personal opinion, his best, Freedom. We'll be taking lots of live questions in the chat. So if you have something to ask Mr. Junger, please go ahead and send it in the chat, whether you're watching us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube. But with that, I'd love to welcome Mr. Sebastian Junger. Sebastian, thanks so much for being here today.
My pleasure. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, I'd love to just, people may know you from your work. I would love to start by having you introduce yourself in your own words. Tell us about yourself.
So I'm a former war reporter, author, documentary filmmaker, father of two little girls, happily married, and I live in New York City. I grew up in Boston. I studied cultural anthropology in college, and that's what got me writing. I was a high climber for tree companies in my 20s. I got hurt pretty badly doing that. That got me thinking about dangerous jobs. I wanted to write about dangerous jobs. That led to my first book, The Perfect Storm. And then after that, I covered wars for about 15 years. And then I stopped after one of my good friends and colleagues got killed in Libya in 2011.
So sorry to hear that. Goodness. And so now you've published so many amazing books. I mean, The Perfect Storm, War, obviously, also big, documentary and films. And, with this book, Freedom, this is a very powerfully and uniquely written book. And I think it's important. Let's start with the back flap quote that states essentially that America can seem like a freight train. And what could stop something that powerful? A train moving in the opposite direction. A country moving so fast with so much weight, only a head-on collision with itself could make it stop. I mean, absolutely beautiful. So I want to go ahead and throw that quote up on the screen and have you kind of talk us through this. What are we trying to say here, and why is it on your back flap?
Well, that came out of a conversation we were having. I mean, I should say, just to back up a bit, if we got a moment, we walked about 400 miles, 350 miles from Washington, D.C. to Philly to Pittsburgh along the railroad lines. We were basically high-speed vagrants, and we were sleeping under bridges and in abandoned buildings and cooking over fires and walking right through the ghettos and the farms and the woods and the wealthy suburbs of America, and from DC to Philly to Pittsburgh. And over the course of 400 miles, I realized later, like, we were the only people at night. We were the only people who knew where we were. Right? Surely that's an important definition of freedom. And one night we were camped out along the railroad lines that ran out along the Juniata River in central Pennsylvania. And it's pretty rugged territory, and we had just gotten shot at. Somebody had shot at us for some reason over our heads, and we had some adventures out there. The police were looking for us. Like, it's not the Appalachian Trail, right? You're not supposed to be out there. It's completely illegal, and we were vagrants, right? And so this freight train went by. We were cooking dinner, and it was getting dark, and this huge freight train went by. They're a mile long. They go 70 miles an hour. They weigh 20 million tons or something, and whatever it is, I can't remember exactly. And I said to one of the guys, like, what would it take to stop a train going that heavy, going that fast in its tracks? And he said, oh, that's easy. Another train going the opposite direction, as the quote says. So it occurred to me later, like, that's America. America is unstoppable. We are by far the wealthiest, most powerful, most industrialized, most high-tech nation in history. And we have the biggest Navy by a factor of 10, I think, of the closest rival nation. we're basically unstoppable. And the only thing I made me realize, the only thing that actually stop us is ourselves, not some other country, not ISIS, not Al Qaeda, not Russia. It's us, and that's what we have to be careful of.
Absolutely. Well, I think Grace Love just put out a question that I think is the very, the next logical question to ask is, to what extent is that a reflection of our future? How is that metaphor manifesting itself in our nation today? Any thoughts, Sebastian, for Grace?
Grace Love is an awesome name, by the way, but I mean, we don't know what the future is, but we do know what the present is and what the past is. And right now, the thing that makes this a powerful country is that we are a democracy. We're imperfect. We do not dispense justice in a perfect way. We do not manage our economy in a completely, in my opinion, we don't manage it in a completely fair way. The income gap is between rich and poor is unseemly. It's so large, right? And it's getting bigger. And there's a host of problems in this country, but we are safe and we are powerful in the world because we're a democracy. And for the first time in my lifetime, the basic assumptions that a democracy depends on seem to be in question. Like, if you win an election, can you assume that the other side will concede? Can you assume that the other side will sort of play fair, play ball, play fair, and try to take power by winning the next set of elections? And right now, that doesn't seem to be how the GOP is sort of running their business. And that, to me, is a very dangerous road to go down. I have to say I'm a Democrat, but if the Democrats were doing what the GOP was doing, I would be like Liz Cheney. I would be relentless in my condemnation of my own party if they were doing the same thing. And because it's terrifying and it's dangerous, and you will bring this country down. There's nothing guaranteeing that we stay together. My father grew up in Spain. He fled the fascists when they came in 1936, and they came in the same way. The progressives won. The Progressive Coalition won an election. The fascists under Francisco Franco said the election was stolen. We've got to regain Spain's honor. The only way to do that is by taking power with force, and that's what they did. And they had 50 years of fascism, and 1% of the country was lined up against a wall and executed by firing squad for their political beliefs. That's what happens when you doubt the legitimacy of elections.
Wow. Sebastian, I got to say, for someone with as powerful of a platform as you have built over the past 20 years, for you to actually use that platform to go out there and stick your neck out on something that you really believe in, I got to say, I really appreciate that. Thank you for doing that. I want to come back to the book and its logical structure, because it's divided into three distinct sections, and I just could not get over how you did this. It's run, fight, and think, which, when I think of the word freedom, running and fighting and thinking actually aren't exactly what's coming first to my mind. I think of my speech, my freedom to assemble, freedom of religion. What is behind the structure of this book?
Well, freedom has been at issue since the advent of human society, 100,000 years ago, whenever you want to start counting. And in most of the animal kingdom, for most mammalian species, a smaller individual cannot outfight a larger one, right? The biggest elk, the biggest grizzly bear, the biggest buffalo, usually male, dominates any physical encounter. And the larger group will win a conflict with the smaller group. But in humans, that's not true. Like, we actually have the ability. I mean, freedom basically means not being controlled by a more powerful group. Essentially, that's the sort of basic core meaning of the word freedom. And so the first way that underdog groups, basically my book is about how do underdog groups maintain their autonomy in the face of a greater power, right? Your reference point is democracy, right? Which is very, very recent, and has basically decided we're gonna play fair for everybody. We're gonna have rules and laws that guarantee everybody's rights. That's recent. The human animal, we're social primates. The human animal has been trying to figure out how to remain autonomous for a lot longer than democracy's been around. freedom is one of the few things, maybe with the addition of community and one's children, that people will die for. And basically they'll die for their own people, they'll die to defend their children, and they will die for their own freedom. And that's about it. So how do we maintain our freedom in the face of a greater power? The first, most obvious way is to run, right? Small, less powerful groups are often more mobile. When you look at the military dynamic between the Taliban and Afghanistan, no air force, no tanks, no artillery. Some of them didn't even have boots, right? And for 20 years, they outfought, or they failed to lose. They managed to not lose against the most powerful military ever in human history, right? Because the thing they had going for them is that they were mobile, right? So I looked at that's where run comes in. I looked at the Apache in the Southwest, a materially poor society compared to the Pueblo societies. But when the Spaniards came in the late 1500s, the Pueblo societies, much wealthier agriculturalists, got rolled up immediately. The Apache remained free by running, by just being evasive, for 300 years, almost until 1900. So if running doesn't work, you're going to have to outfight them, right? And as I said, in most mammals, the larger group or the larger individual wins the fight. Not true in humans. And so in fight, I go through the sort of dynamics that make this possible in the human species. And another great example are the Montenegrins. The Ottoman Empire invaded Montenegro in the early 1600s. They outnumbered the Montenegrins 12-1, right? This is the Ottoman Empire was the most powerful military force at the time in the world. The Montenegrins were this scattering of mountain tribes, outnumbered 12-1. They killed 1/3 of the Montenegrin force and sent the rest packing, right? Uniquely human. That ability is uniquely human. So if you can't outrun them, outfight them. If you can't outfight them, you're going to have to outthink them. And that basically applies to a society where you're not going to overthrow the government. You're not going to run away. You're an American citizen. You are a mill worker in 1912 in Lawrence, Massachusetts. The conditions are horrendous, not fit. I mean, a shame, a deep shame for any democracy to produce living conditions for anybody like what was happening in Lawrence 100 years ago. And what do? You have to outthink the government. You're in a big game of chess. And that's where the Irish did it against the British 100 years ago. And that's where this sort of complex chess game comes in again for the underdog group against the greater power.
Wow, that is such a beautiful point. And we had several reactions from our audience. I want to call in Mr. Gavin Church, a dear friend from long ago, and I served in combat with him, actually. He says, this is a great point. It is countries which get so large and powerful which destroy themselves. Do you, Sebastian, see the danger being heavy wielding of power on the right and left, where a middle doesn't exist? And I think there's something to be said here, because in some ways, if the two ideologies in this country have decided that both of their quote unquote freedoms are under threat, is it this, are we actually just vacating the middle and imploding from within? Does this sentiment resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, and there's another question by someone named Doc Springer who's, gets to that point as well. I'm just seeing it on the screen here. Many veterans took place in the Capitol uprising, and they felt they were defending American freedom. The word freedom has been misused, grotesquely misused by many, many people throughout history to justify illegal actions or immoral actions. Franco, when the fascists took over in Spain, Franco claimed that he was fighting for Spanish freedom. It doesn't matter what people feel. Feelings don't matter. The law matters, right? If you believe that, I could be charged with murder and feel that I'm not guilty, and if a jury finds me guilty, it doesn't matter what I feel. I'm going to jail, right? Sorry, my feelings don't matter. The law matters. So if people, veterans or otherwise, believe that the election was fraudulent, there's recourse. You go to the courts, right? And if the courts don't work, you try to win re-election next time around. The entire Republican leadership declared that the election was free and fair. The entire Republican leadership, right? So at some point, when people say, well, I feel like I'm fighting for freedom, what they're really doing is dredging up this powerful word to use as a kind of rhetorical shield to deflect criticism for something that was deeply illegal and completely undemocratic and absolutely anti every fundamental understanding of how freedom works in a democracy.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely captivating, Sebastian. I have been struggling with something, Sebastian, and it's something that I wrote to you earlier and I wanted to ask you, but this quote from your book hit me hard. The central problem with human freedom is that groups, excuse me, I'm just going to pull it up here, is that groups well organized to defend themselves against others are organized enough to oppress their own. As a former soldier myself, this year in particular, I've struggled to be thanked for my service sometimes, particularly when the word freedom is invoked. Thanks for protecting our freedom, etc. Because let's be honest here, many Americans have been denied freedom by the government we served, right? And at various points, serving in the military meant protecting the freedom to enslave, the freedom to discriminate on race or sexual orientation, the freedom to displace natives, the freedom to intern Japanese citizens or imprison a disproportionate part of the Black community. How should veterans in particular, and I know this is a sensitive topic, particularly because we're talking on D-Day, and a lot of people, might find this a hard question to discuss, but how, in your opinion, should veterans reconcile the fact that the government we serve to protect our freedoms denied them for so many other Americans as well? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, we can't, what happened 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago is something we need to study. But it's not something that people who are alive and in powerful positions today themselves created, right? So we have to, right now, we have to focus on what is the situation in America right now. And it's not completely fair, right? I mean, let's just say that just right out of the gate, it's not completely fair. What I would say, I mean, just think about this, think deeply about this. There were African-American soldiers who came back from World War II, right? They came back to America, this country that they defended, this democracy that they fought for, and they could not sit at lunch counters in some cities. Think about that, right? That's not that long ago, right? That's in my dad's lifetime. I mean, my dad was half Jewish. There were hotels. I mean, he worked for the U.S. Navy. He designed, he helped design nuclear submarines, right? He worked on the NASA launches, right? There were hotels in Washington he couldn't stay in because he was half Jewish, right? So the sins of even this amazing democracy, the sins of this country are endless, right? But what do we have right now? When you fight a war, and are you coming back to a country that is fair and equitable? Some would say it's in the eye of the beholder. What I would say is that freedom and justice and one's rights, they're not all the same thing. You can have a free country, and that describes the representative government that's achieved through free and fair elections. You could have a free country that does not have a completely just society in it, right? When people say they're defending their freedoms, and sometimes they put an S at the end of the word. I think George Bush started that, and to me, as a sort of grammarian, I always sort of wince a little bit. I think what they mean is their rights. You know what I mean? Your freedom is self-given, right? I mean, freedom means that your society is able to defend itself against an enemy that will kill or enslave you, and that it then turns around and deals with its own population in fair and egalitarian ways, right? I mean, that's where freedom comes from. Justice is its own particular topic that has to be looked at, and one's rights. I mean, this is a free country, but you actually don't have the right to run red lights. Sorry, man, you just don't. I don't care how free you think you are. You don't have the right to drive on the left-hand side of the road because you're going to freaking kill somebody, right? And you're going to get pulled over, and you're going to go to jail, and you should go to jail. And it doesn't mean it's not a free country. You don't have the right to do it. Rights are given by the society to the individual. And justice is a matter for all of us to continue to work at, because very clearly in this society, some people experience better forms of justice than others. Let's just put it that way.
If I may plant a seed in your head, Sebastian, I mean, we've got war, yes, tribe, freedom. I'm sensing justice.
Justice, here it comes. Yeah.
Let's do it, man. Let's go.
I do have my next book planned out. It is a one-word title. We can talk about it later if you want. But thank you. I appreciate it, though. But it's very important to maintain a sort of some separators between those words, because when they start to blend together, you use the word freedom. As I said, it's a very potent word. As soon as someone says, "I'm fighting for my freedom," everyone, it's like everyone's like, "Oh, whoa, okay, yeah, no problem, man. Yeah, you're fighting for your freedom. I won't even question what you're doing," right? You're really talking about your rights. And when you're talking about rights, you can really examine them and decide, some rights are legitimate and some rights aren't. The right to drive on the left-hand side of the road actually is not a legitimate right. It's not a right that you have. And that's where the conversation comes in. Do you have the right to not wear a mask if that endangers other people? I don't have the answers here, but that is where the conversation happens. Like, you're part of a society, you accrue all of its benefits. What do you owe it in return? The government's job, one of its jobs, is to keep us all safe. So when the government says we're in a pandemic, masks will keep transmissions of blah, 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 like you do have an obligation to do what your group has collectively decided to do. That actually is an obligation in any society, whether you're on a life raft in the middle of the ocean or an early hunter-gatherer or an American. Like that is just what being part of a group means.
Absolutely. And as you were talking, I looked up another quote that I think is very powerful, and I'd love to read it to you and see how this applies to you. Occasionally, you'd catch a child's face frozen in astonishment as they locked eyes with you before getting swept on up the tracks. Adults never seemed to look out the window long enough for that to happen, I thought. It was always the children who saw you. And in this context, you're along the railroad tracks, and I think what I feel is happening is this passenger train is going through a tunnel perhaps, and it's the children who are actually not looking at their phones, not working. It's the children looking eyes and have their eyes on you. And you are on the side of the road, and looking what I could imagine as a destitute. You're looking like a vagrant, right? Yeah. And, I'm just curious, what is this, when especially as a new father myself, this line really stuck out to me. The children are watching us. So what is the purpose of this phrase? What message are we trying to infer from it?
I was just trying to explain the environment there. We're walking along the railroad lines. It's completely illegal. We have to be, when we hear trains coming, the engineers would call us in. So if a train was coming, we would step into the underbrush and wait for the engineer to blow by. And then we could step back out. And, often, the passenger trains would go by. They're shorter, not as heavy, but they were going 100, $120. They would really scream sometimes. They would slam past really fast. And I just wanted to give a sense of what it's like to have this sort of rocket go by you when you're on foot. And I just, the adults are also busy. They're on their phones, they're doing whatever they're doing, but the children are still sort of amazed by the world. And they stare out the window, and every once in a while I'd sort of lock eyes with this kid. And I always wondered, like, what's that kid, what did he think of what he just saw for a moment? Like, Mommy, there's some men out there. Like, what happened in the cabin after they saw us? Like, it was 4 men and a dog, and none of us looked too good. We were moving 10, 15, 20 miles a day. Once we did 40 miles in 40 hours. We're carrying 60, 70 pounds. We're cooking for ourselves over fires, drinking out of creeks. We got sick from the water. We got all kinds of messed up, right? And I'm sure I got back to New York once after one of the, we did it over the course of a year. We did it in chunks, like 50, 100 miles at a time. I got back to New York. It was right before Hurricane Sandy, and it was just like torrential rain. I had my dog in my backpack, and I was walking up the street back to my home, and this guy in a suit, he was so sweet. He stopped and he goes, "Hey man, do you need some food?" I was like, "No, I'm good. But then I looked down at myself. I was like, "Oh, of course he asked that." Like I looked like hell. So yeah, we blended into our environment. There's a lot of marginal people out there. We met some very some really poignant stories. And we wanted to meet America. We didn't hike the Appalachian Trail because we wanted to meet America. The railroad lines go right through the heart of America, and you meet some amazing people. And some of them are incredibly poor, and I got to say, the poorer the community, the cooler they are, the more generous they are. And I grew up in a rich town, so I know how that works. And sometimes we're on surface roads in like wealthy suburbs, and that's when people would call the cops. In towns like what I grew up in.
That's incredible. When I read that quote, what the thing that kind of what it pulled out in me is this sort of self-awareness of my apathy, right? Like I'm so in my day-to-day mired in my work, right? So that, and I'm heads down, I'm just trying, and I live comfortably, right? My wife and I, we have a house, we're, doing well. We're not worried about our next meal, etc. Yet at the same time, that apathy with my child now watching the world outside the window and seeing all the things that I am blocking out, I am now part of the problem in some ways of letting that happen as a citizen that is just so focused internally. And so I really appreciated that statement. It brought out a lot of emotion for me as a new father. Yeah. I want to go to the live chat because we've got quite a few comments and interesting questions coming in. I want to actually read this comment from Mr. Eric Edstrom. Thanks, Sebastian. I read War before heading to Afghanistan, 09-010. Thanks for giving voice to the passion, futility, and dysfunction of war. Eric Edstrom is also the author of the book Un-American, where he tells his story of the dysfunction he experienced in Afghanistan on the ground. I highly recommend it. And we did an interview with him on 99 Pages a few months back, so check that out. I'd also love to call out Mrs. Doc Springer here. I think a very interesting question. For veterans, I wonder how much does coming back to a society that strips you of your rank and sees you either as a hero or broken contribute to a vulnerability to extremism? And I think she's referencing perhaps veterans that might have been perhaps radicalized over the past few years. And and first off, I think the premise of her question is interesting. Do you find that the United States either sort of views a veteran as a hero or broken? I think it's a really interesting framework.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of misconceptions. I think Americans think that any veteran was in combat. Most veterans were not in combat. There's I've heard different figures from 1 in 10 to 1 in 3 are actually, frontline combat troops. So veterans weren't necessarily traumatized. I think one thing that's very hard is that they come back from a very close-knit platoon. Even if you're in a rear base, it's a very close-knit group. It's much like our sort of primordial human past, where you're totally dependent on each other and connected to each other, and then you're ripped out of that and dumped back in society. And I think that there's a real loss there that can lead to depression and a sense of anxiety and vulnerability. I think the word hero is probably overused generally, and not necessarily referring to veterans, just in general. Like it's the top word, right? So if everybody's a hero, then what do we do with someone who's a Medal of Honor recipient? What's the word for them? There has to be some sort of gradient of heroism, and it's enormously noble to serve your country or to be a fireman or a school teacher or whatever. I mean, these things are very, very noble, but words have meanings, and broken is also this there's a whole levels of trauma, right? You can be slightly traumatized, or you can be broken and non-functional in a psychological sense. So, these words are sort of overused. What I would say is that when you come back, society doesn't strip you of your rank. It makes you get out of uniform. I mean, there isn't even a question of rank. You are no longer a soldier. And I think veterans and everybody else on the planet likes to feel special. Of course you like to feel special, right? I mean, we all do, right? And being in a close-knit unit, doing something as intense as being in the U.S. military and prosecuting a war, whatever your role is, whatever your MOS was, that's intense, and that can make you feel special. And then what society asks you to do is say, okay, you know what? Forget all that. You're just going to be one of us now, right? And I understand that that's very, very hard, but I'll put it this way. The big question is, how can we help veterans reintegrate back into society? That's never going to happen if the veteran refuses to give up their veteran identity. Because reintegrating into society means becoming a civilian again. And that doesn't mean it wasn't valuable. It doesn't mean it wasn't meaningful. That changes nothing about the experience that you had. But the question is, how do you want to go forward from here? And if you really want to rejoin society, you are going to have to let go, like an athlete. Great athletes have to do this all the time in their 30s and 40s, right? Like, wow, I was an amazing running back, but now I'm a guy with bad knees, like, how do I just become a normal person again? And, it's a profound human question. Veterans hit it, but frankly, everybody hits it when they turn 30, 40, 50, 60. They lose their looks, their knees go south. Come on, man. Like, you're just, everyone's going to become average, right? And if you're not at peace with that, you're never going to be happy. You are never going to live a peaceful, tranquil, meaningful life.
Yeah, and for some of that degradation comes a little earlier. I tell you, man. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, right.
We have a couple interesting questions coming in again. Actually, this is I would love to throw this one out because I think it's a good one. Sebastian, what is your dog's name? I mean, that's kind of a good one.
Her name was Daisy. She left us a couple of years ago, unfortunately. She was an amazing dog. Beautiful.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. She also had a very interesting question. You grew up in an affluent neighborhood, as you just said. What drew you to war? What drew you to these conflicts? Like, if you, having grown up in maybe which is described as is like an affluent upbringing, what is it about like military conflict, that combat, that you think spoke to you?
I grew up. My dad was from Europe, and I grew up listening to, he grew up in Spain and fled the fascists in Spain. He moved to France and fled the fascists in France when the Germans came in, and came to this country because he knew the fascists would never come here. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think he would look, January 6th that was essentially a fascist attack on our capital, on our democracy. The previous attack on that building was 9/11, right? The fourth airplane was targeted for that building. And the people in, the Al-Qaeda were fascists too, right? They believe in power over democracy. And some very brave Americans brought that plane down in a field in Pennsylvania. We walked pretty much right past it on our trek. And then it happened again in January 6th. And so I grew up with these stories about this this grand fight between decency and fascism in the world. Right. And war had affected my father enormously. And I was curious about it. And I was a young man. I was about 30. I guess I wasn't that young, but I wanted to be a journalist. And there was a civil war in Bosnia. Right. The U.S. was not involved. This was a civil war. Sarajevo was besieged by fascists. Right. Once again, here they come. Right. And they're shelling a city filled with civilians. It's filled with children. They're shelling it with artillery, right? And I'm like, I want to know what that's about. I think I wanted to test myself as a young man. I felt like it was a shortcut to another level of journalism that I wanted to get to. And I wanted to understand war is important. It's super important. I wanted to experience it and understand it.
Absolutely. In our audience, I know we have a lot of veterans that are attending today. And one of my favorite quotes from your book that, when we tend to glorify military leadership as like the epic standard of what a leader is. And you have a quote here that really I've been quoting all week, which leaders who aren't willing to make sacrifices aren't leaders. They're opportunists. And I think this is really interesting because I think just grammatically, when I think of what is the opposite of a leader, I think of a follower, just in terms of definition. Yeah. But you actually say, it's actually not followership. It's opportunism that is the antithesis of leadership. Yeah. Would you mind telling us a little bit about what you mean?
Yeah. So until the late 1300s, the kings of Europe, when they went to war, led their men in battle from a horse with a sword in their hand, and they were at the front of the line. Right. The last the last European monarch who died in battle was in the late 1300s. After that, they started sending men off to war to do their fighting for them. And real leadership, and if you in any hunter-gatherer group, in any insurrection or uprising, political uprising, any rebel group, anyone trying to overthrow a dictatorship, in all of these underdog groups, I tried to look at, like, what do they have in common? The ones that work, what do they have in common? These are groups that really don't have much to spare, right? If they're going to win against this greater power, they have to do everything right. So we can take some good lessons about how to run a healthy society by the way they organize themselves. And one of the hallmarks of these groups is that the leadership will die for the cause. Your leaders are supposed to be willing to die for you. And that's true for us, right? It's not true literally, physically in America, because our country is safely enough guarded by a military that we don't need the president out there with an AK-47. So let's look at the metaphorical equivalent of willing to die for your people, right? What would that be? I think that would be willing to lose an election on a principle, say a principle of democracy, the way Liz Cheney just did. Now, I'm a Democrat. I can't imagine voting for Liz Cheney if I lived in Wyoming. But my God, she impressed the hell out of me. She threw herself on the hand grenade for democracy, right? That's taking a bullet for something you believe in, taking a bullet for your people. Let's take it a step further. Being in the government puts you in a very, very powerful position, which you can misuse very, very easily. And if you want to sort of trade favors for money, like from industry, like, it's not that hard to do. Clearly, it's not that hard to do, because there are many, many congressmen who are multimillionaires, right? Like, how is it that Mitch McConnell, on a salary of what, 180K a year, how is it that Mitch McConnell has tens of millions of dollars? Can someone explain the math there? Like, so making a sacrifice for your people in the context of a democracy would mean standing up to lies and losing an election if you have to, and not exploiting your position to amass huge amounts of money, right? I see a lot of people in our government failing those tests. I don't think Trump passed it. I don't think Mitch McConnell's passing it. I don't think the Clintons passed it. I mean, it's really demoralizing. And if you're not willing to give up an election on a principle, if you're not willing to like say no to the 10 million because it's a goddamn disgrace for a democracy to work that way, you know what? I'm guessing you wouldn't die for me. I'm guessing you wouldn't take it. And that means you're not a leader. Like, that's what we deserve. That's what we deserve in our government.
Fired up. That is awesome. I want to bring out this quote from Eric, because I think it's a great next step. It feels like you've thrown yourself into the American condition from many perspectives. And so, Sebastian, if you were a benevolent dictator, let's just say you're all powerful in this example, what is the one, or let's say two things that you would want to change about America, and what would you see that benefiting in terms of these problems that you're citing? I think this would be an interesting to hear your thoughts.
All right, so if I was a benevolent dictator in America, I would say the first thing we need to do is get me out of here and establish a democracy, because this country is a democracy, and one person cannot make decisions. Even a benevolent person cannot make decisions like that in a democracy. We need a democratic process. But if on my way out the door, if people begged me to like do one good thing for America, I think I would get money out of politics. It's destroying this country. And the Democrats are just as bad as the Republicans. And it's reinforcing this sort of ghastly circle of like corporate interests that pay for favors, and then congressmen write laws that benefit corporations and not the population. And the sort of trickle down theory is, well, if the corporations do well, then we all do well. And it's complete nonsense. That's a friggin' lie, right? And so, I would say is you get the money out of the politics. But the problem is you need the government to write those laws, and they won't, because they're making money at all this. I mean, a lot of them, not all of them. There's some really, really good people in Congress, but enough of them are making a huge amount of money at this that they're never going to change the game so it's not rigged. So if I was a dictator, I would say, I'm changing that, and it would be I don't know, what are they, executive orders? And then on the way out the door, I would say, and now you got to start voting. I'm not going to do this any longer.
Now you gotta start voting. I love it. That's a good one. I want to call out another really awesome quote in your book that I think might be an interesting segue. It's an important part of freedom is not having to make sacrifices for those people who don't have to sacrifice for you. And this is something that's kind of interesting, is because if I'm going to say that I'm going to give up my pound, take the money out of politics, if I'm going to, wear a mask, in one sense, what I'm hearing in this statement is that there's a level of interconnectedness in American society that we need to actually feel in order to make sacrifices. So when I wear a mask, or when I pay my taxes, or when I take the money out of politics and say, yep, that's a good idea, it's because you and I are interconnected. And I know that I'm willing to sacrifice for the betterment of our society, because others in the society will do that for me. And when I read this quote, I was thinking, we live in a digital age. When COVID happened and we were locked out of the office, not other than me like having a great time in the mountains this year, working remotely from Tahoe, like not much actually changed for me, right? I was able to do my job digitally, and it just went to show how weak my ties to my physical community were. And so I'm curious, Sebastian, like what is the takeaway here? How do we make it feel? And instinctively, how do we know that when I make a sacrifice with my vote, with my dollar, with my behaviors, that how do I know that you and I are interconnected? How do we increase that feeling in our society?
Well, first of all, let's just acknowledge that both you and I can see your room, you can see my room. Well, I have a brick wall behind me, but just trust me, it's an apartment. Like everything in both of our apartments is mass produced by a modern, mechanized, highly technological society that we are completely dependent on. And if somehow you all that stuff disappeared, we both of us would be dead in a few days, probably, if we were just dropped into nature by ourselves, right? We are completely connected to our society. We're just not connected to the people, and in really tragic ways. We're an affluent society, so we can afford to live these very individualistic lives, and it gives us the illusion of actually not having to do anything for the group, because the group is increasingly an abstraction. And the things that keep us alive, the fire department, the police, farmers, et cetera, all those have been sort of subcontracted out to specialists, and most people are just sort of floating along in this sort of material world that they pay for by having a job. Okay, so what I would say is that just this idea of reciprocal obligation, what I mean by that is taxes are fair because the people that wrote the tax laws also have to pay taxes. The people that enforce the tax laws, they pay taxes, right? If it were such that the people that wrote the tax laws for all of us didn't have to pay taxes, well, then that's not fair. And that gets to, arguably some points about Donald Trump's sort of like, accounting trickery, where he's, writing off huge amounts, basically not paying taxes. That gets to where it starts to feel unfair that the people in power, and that just means elite, affluent people that know congressmen and they know judges and they know God knows what else, that they actually get to sort of rig the game, and we're all paying our taxes, and they're getting. Not one person went to jail after the financial collapse of 2008. Not one person. And those people were getting bailed out. The nation bailed those companies out, while the heads of those companies were taking $10 million, $100 million year-end bonuses, while the nations were bailing out the companies that those men ruined, right? Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, that's not reciprocal obligation. But to return to a more visceral point, how do you feel connected in human terms to a huge society where you're maybe not physically interdependent with people immediately around you? Here's 3 simple ways, all right, that I think they're slightly symbolic, but listen, symbolism's great. I mean, ask the church. A religious ritual is all about symbolism. It's extremely powerful. I'm an atheist, but so here's the 3 ways. First of all, last summer, I almost died. I had an undiagnosed aneurysm in my pancreatic artery, extremely rare. I'd had it my whole life. It ruptured out of the blue. I lost 90% of my blood into my abdomen. Within a few minutes, I started going blind. The survival rate for something like this is virtually non-existent. And they got me to the hospital an hour and a half later. I was still alive. I was dying. My dead father appeared above me, consoling me, and I was getting pulled down a black hole while this doctor above me was cutting open my neck to put a line in to try to get blood into me to save my life. And the last thing I said to him is, "Doc, hurry up, you're losing me right now." And I got pulled into this hole. And they did it. 10 people saved my life. I needed 10 units of blood, right? And I don't know who those people are. They contributed their blood. They donated their blood because they believe in the human race. They believe in helping other people. They believe in this country. They believe in compassion. So donate blood. If you donate blood, you will feel like you're part of this amazing thing. I promise you, because now I'm donating blood. I'm going to donate as much blood as I possibly can for the rest of my life. And the great thing about blood is, you know what? It's free of all of our stupid biases, right? White, black, rich, poor, I don't care what, blood doesn't care, right? We all have the same stuff in our veins. And you can put the blood of a racist into an African-American. You can put a poor person's blood into a rich person's blood. It doesn't matter at all. We need it all. And it reminds you what you're really part of. The second thing is vote. When you vote, you're saying that your country needs you and that you need your country. It's saying both things, right? And both are true. And finally, serve on jury duty. Do not get out of jury duty. Serve on jury duty. Jury duty is the only thing that stands between us and tyranny. Basically, not the only thing. One of the only things that stands between us and tyranny. It means that one person, not a judge, not a police chief, not a president, one person cannot decide the fate of another person. Only a jury can do that. It's a sacred duty. They're all sacred duties. If you do those three things, not only will you save this country from whatever tough times is coming up, but you may save yourself as a human being. You may suddenly realize what an amazing thing you're part of, and that might be exactly what you need to put some meaning, some significance into your life that may have been missing until now.
Donate blood, vote, serve on jury duty. 3 simple things that we can do to just make our society a bit more cohesive and thus stronger. I love it. It's so simple. I got to ask, after that horrific story, I'm so sorry to hear about that aneurysm in your pancreas. I got to ask, you mentioned it earlier, but you say you're working on a new book. If there is any, hints or teasers you could give us, I know we'd all love to know what you're working on. What's in your head?
Yeah, my next book is going to be called Pulse. And it's about what keeps us alive and what happens when we die. I mean, I'm an atheist. I'm an anti-mystic. I am not religious. My dad was a physicist. I believe in things that you can test, that you can measure. That's how I view the world. And for the life of me, I have no idea what my dead father was doing there talking to me as I was dying, right? And what I came to find out was that's a very common thing. And that people that are dying often have no idea they're dying. I actually didn't know I was dying. I just didn't want to go into the big pit. I was getting pulled into a cold pit. I was like, I don't want to go down there, right? I didn't know I was dying. My father knew, right? And it's really, really common for dying people to be visited by dead relatives, dead ancestors. And they advise them, right? And I just talked to a guy who said he was dying of COVID, and he saw this beautiful, cool pillow. He just wanted to put his head down on it. And his dead mother showed up and said, "Don't lie down. Do not lie down." And he didn't lie down. And that was when he started to recover. He was right on the edge. Wow. So I want to explain that in rational scientific terms, like what the hell is going on with those experiences. You can't reproduce them with drugs, with oxygen deprivation. You have to be dying. And it's incredible. Crazy. Yeah.
Well, when you do get ready to release that book, I hope you'll come back onto 99 Pages and let us talk to you about it, because that sounds riveting.
Yeah, thank you.
Another former soldier of mine in my platoon in 2-1 Infantry in Afghanistan, Mr. Aaron Estabrook, currently serving as a commissioner in Kansas. How does today's call-out culture or cancel culture impact tribalism? I think this is interesting. The idea of cancel culture, when I hear, and maybe just a loose definition, it's the societal it's a societal condemnation of certain acts that we decide, even though in historical context might have been appropriate, but in modern context are inappropriate. But yet when we cancel them, we may be literally just turning a blind eye to important parts of our history. And I think we see this a lot right now, both in art, in American history, statues, etc. So curious your thoughts here. Are folks that are passionate about creating change, particularly in the, let's say in the areas of racism, etc., are we actually just infuriating and further polarizing ourselves? I mean, what is your advice to this next generation, people that really care about change, rather than canceling out the bigotry that we see in the media or in our historical landmarks? What should the right response be?
Well, I think what the question is really more about is cancel culture as a pejorative. I mean, it's a critical term, right? And so here's the problem. Some people do really, really bad things, right? And they get, quote, canceled, right? They should lose their job. They should go to jail. Like all kinds of bad things should happen to people who do bad things, right? That's not canceling in the pejorative sense, right? There should be consequences for committing antisocial acts. If Matt Gaetz, I don't know how to pronounce his name, down in Florida, if he actually did the things that he's accused of doing, of course he should be canceled. He should be canceled straight into prison, right? But so here's the thing: is like the people that are being accused of serious crimes that don't want to get attacked. They say, "Oh no, it's cancel culture," like as if they should be forgiven. But then on the other side of it, the tiniest sort of cultural transgressions, the tiniest verbal slips, often on the far left, can have completely outsized consequences in terms of. I mean, I know an amazing man. He's a college professor at in East Coast College, and he's leaving because the verbal constraints of what he's allowed to say without having his job be jeopardized. I mean, there was one student who just didn't turn in a term paper or the final exam, and he emailed them and said, "What am I to conclude from this?" Right? That kid went to the administration and accused him of something ghastly, like unspeakable, right? So there's the misuse of that power, right? But then on the other side, there's people saying, "Oh, it's cancel culture. Don't mind me that I had sex with a bunch of underage girls." So both things are enormously problematic. And at the end of the day, there are laws. You break the law, you go to jail. And if you don't, I don't quite know where society, a certain segment of society, thinks it has the right to tell you how to speak. Like, you can't tell me how to speak, right? And so that it gets super complicated. But yeah, it is kind of tribal. But we're social primates. We are tribal. That's why we have laws, so that our tribalism doesn't dominate our existence.
Well said. There's a book that came to mind as you were talking, particularly about the context of a college professor, Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah.
And really what I took away from that book, and I think is what you're saying, is like ideas themselves are not the threat, right? Like the idea, right. An idea espoused by a college professor in the safety of an academic institution. I mean, that by itself isn't threatening, but obviously an incident like Mr. Gaetz or actual. I mean, it's important to differentiate that. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. We're coming a little bit toward the end of our time here. And Sebastian, this has been just, again, a phenomenal conversation. But the last question I want to ask you here is really just about you and your change as a man. Having gone through this exploration, this has been a journey, not only writing this book, but even this trip you took several years ago. Did this book have you, as you went through the process of writing this book, did it make you have greater faith in our nation, in our future? Did it less faith? How are you a different man and father at the end of this journey than you were at the beginning?
Well, I mean, the beginning, the trek that I took along the railroad lines began when I was in my early 50s. I'm now 59. So that comprises, maybe the most important decade of a person's life, or certainly a most important decade of my life. And the main change that happened, I mean, I was going through a divorce during that trek. It wasn't a form of therapy. It was a chance to be dirty and exhausted and sometimes scared and often very miserable with some guys I was extremely close to, and put my mind in a different place where I wasn't thinking about this very sad passage, and it was a friendly divorce. I'm still good friends with my ex-wife, but it was extremely sad. And it just allowed me to put my mind in a different place. And I'm remarried and I have 2 young children. I'm a father. And not only is being a father the most important reality in my life at the moment, it's the most important reality that I have ever had at any point in my life. Like, this is it. And I don't know, maybe I wouldn't have felt this way at 25, but here I am at 59. I've done a whole lot of things that I'm very proud of. I have absolutely no desire to keep doing them. I want to be a really good dad. And so my book is dedicated to my family. And what I say in the dedication is they allowed me to feel a form of freedom that I didn't even know existed. And so I would say now I'm a free man. And, there's physical freedom, there's emotional freedom, spiritual freedom, there's, all different kinds. And for me, the most important kind of freedom right now is the kind that I'm blessed to experience.
Very powerful words. Well, Sebastian, if you don't mind, I think we're going to end our interview there, because I just cannot imagine anything more powerful being said. It's absolutely beautiful. Folks, thank you all for tuning in. We had absolutely fantastic engagement. Thank you for your questions, your attention on what I believe to be a very important book for the remainder of this year. It is Freedom by Sebastian Junger. It is a short but powerful read. I urge you to read it not as literal nonfiction. Read it in the same vein as you would read a Thoreau, a Hemingway. It is to be read with thought and in a deliberate fashion that you would read poetry, right? And I think as I did it, I mean, I took loads of notes and just rereading these quotes, as you can see during that we brought up during this talk. It captivates the mind and forces you to think through layers of experiences in your own life that have helped you define the word freedom itself. And I think particularly at this moment in time, it is a conversation that every American should be having, not only with themselves, but with their families, with their friends, and with their communities. So I highly encourage you to pick up a copy, Freedom by Sebastian Junger. Folks, it's been a wonderful conversation. I want to thank everyone for their engagement, their time on their Sundays. I hope you have a wonderful week. Thanks to all of our veterans out there on this anniversary of D-Day. And Sebastian, thank you for your thoughtful writing, for being a great voice for many of us who served, and a great conscience for our country. We're very grateful.
Well, listen, I'm thrilled to be on the show, and thank you so much for your amazing questions and for liking my book. I'm really honored.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. All right, everybody.